Kenya's Parliamentary Budget Office has said that the country could raise as much as 110 billion Kenyan shillings, about $878.5 million, by selling stakes in state-owned companies to help reduce its fiscal deficit. The sales could generate about 30 billion shillings annually in the medium term, depending on the method of the asset sales, targeted companies, and response from potential buyers. Now, President William Ruto directed his administration to urgently prepare to sell stakes in some of the country's 248 corporations, with a view to reducing the burden of providing bailouts to companies in distress. The income generated will also help the government's plan to reduce the budget deficit to 4.3% of GDP in the year beginning July, from an estimated 5.8% in the current period. Joining me now from Nairobi, Kenya's Satchu, Africa Geo-economist, macro analyst, and the CEO of Rich Management. Khan, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So let's take a bit of a trip back down memory lane. I like to always establish sort of why we're having a conversation in the present time. And we've heard a lot of the reasons that government has given as to why this privatization drive is the next thing. It's the next step in the evolution of all of this. But in the meantime, we need to get an idea of how Kenya got to this point where it is really considering probably moving towards selling state-owned enterprises, or at least some stakes in those state-owned enterprises. So how did Kenya get here?
So firstly, Kenya actually had a program of privatization during the Kibaki administration from the years 2003 until 2013, and it was extremely successful. We saw a whole slew of parastatals floated on the stock market. KenGen, Kenya Electricity Generating Companies, one. We saw the listing of Safaricom, that was another. And essentially that completely stalled and came to a screeching halt during the administration of Uhuru Kenyatta. It's not clear to me why it did come to a screeching halt, other than that the government at that time under President Kenyatta was simply not interested in the stock market. And this was evidenced by the fact that I think the president did not visit the stock market even once. The pressure now to reinvigorate the privatization program is being driven by the fiscal position, which is extremely poor. You mentioned the lack of foreign exchange. You mentioned the deficit. So President Ruto is now seeking to reinvigorate this program and utilize the cash in order to improve the fiscal position of the country.
So would you say the previous privatization program was a successful one, if we see President William Ruto willing to go back down that route?
It was absolutely successful. It introduced 2 million new shareholders to the stock exchange. It basically created a virtuous feedback loop where unprofitable companies in the public sector turned profitable in the private sector, reducing the burden on the government, increasingly paying taxes. So it became a self-reinforcing positive feedback loop and was a great success. And I think that there is an opportunity to do that all over again. The amounts you were quoting, which came from that Parliamentary Budget Office report, I think were very conservative. I think there's an opportunity to raise considerably more than Parliament was projecting. And I think it's an exciting prospect for the country.
Okay, so you're taking me to what was going to be my last question, but since you brought up the amount, it's estimated that Kenya could raise about 110 billion shillings, around $878.5 million, by selling its stakes in state-owned companies. Now, the sales could also generate about 30 billion shillings, I beg your pardon, annually in the medium term. But this depends on the method of the asset sales, the targeted companies, and also the response from potential buyers. So if you're saying that you think this is a bit conservative, what do you think we could be looking at, depending on if Kenya puts forth the best of its companies, gets a very positive return, or rather response from potential buyers, and of course is also able to do this in a method that gives it the most profits at the end of the day? And what could that money, let's even say the 30 billion shillings annually, really do for Kenya realistically?
So look, I think, of course, you want to sell, in order to get the program going, you're going to have to sell companies which are already profitable, where investors can see growth. The other thing to consider is if you want to sell it to your citizens, you've got to sell it at a reasonable price so that they are going to get a profit, pretty much an immediate profit, because you want to keep the pipeline flowing. If you try and squeeze the lemon too hard, you're not going to get a follow-on response. My thinking is that, you could quite easily raise $1 billion a year during this privatization program if you're bringing the right exciting companies to the market. At the moment, the government's on the hook for a total of about 1.3 trillion shillings in financial support, loan support, etc., for these 248 companies that you mentioned. And therefore, it's very important that that liability is reduced and is made to sweat harder and eventually provide a return to the government.
So let's talk about the government and who might be involved. So many labor unions across the continent, they tend to put up a very big fight when it comes to the issue of privatization of state-owned enterprises. But we also know that in realistic terms, many African economies can no longer afford to hold on to these companies just because of labor unions. In disposing or selling government assets, it's also not unusual to see individuals who acquire key assets at understated prices, coupled with a lack of transparency, among other things. So in terms of the process for Kenya in this situation, what risk do you think might be involved? What are we hearing from the labor unions? 248 state-owned companies is not anything to sneeze at. They're going to have a large labor force, maybe not the total or a very large percentage when it comes to Kenya overall, but they do have a labor force that can be quite interesting and active. And in terms of the transparency issues, do you think there are reasons to be concerned?
So you're raising a number of very valid questions. Firstly, about labor unions. I mean, typically employment in the state sector tends to be less efficient from a shareholder point of view than it is in the private sector. So clearly, there will be some attrition in terms of jobs as companies become leaner and more efficient in the private sector. And therefore, you will see some friction out of the labor unions. But I think ultimately it is better for shareholders, it is better for citizens that these companies are efficiently and profitably run. And therefore labor unions too have to recognize that point, that remaining in an unsustainable business is not a long-term prospect. So that's the first thing, but it is a very sensitive issue and will need to be handled appropriately. Your question about transparency is a very important one. We saw many what I would call suboptimal, non-transparent transactions done in the death throes of the previous regime, and you see this happen across the continent, where favored insiders are bought out of situations or are able to purchase assets at rock bottom prices. And in this regard, we need to have very transparent processes and fair dealing. And there is always a risk that we don't have that. But I think clearly in this case, it behoves the government to be as transparent as possible if they are serious about doing something material to their current portfolio, which I'm afraid is underperforming woefully.
All right, let's go to the bill that we know in January was actually presented. So the draft privatization bill 2023 was shared in January, and Kenyans had about 2 weeks to also share their comments. Now, this bill seeks to provide a regulatory framework for the privatization of public entities, including state-owned enterprises. The draft bill also seeks to establish the Privatization Authority, which, among other things, will advise the government on all aspects of privatization of public entities, facilitate the implementation of government policies on privatization, implement the privatization program, and implement specific privatization proposals in accordance with the privatization program. So, Ali Khan, in terms of what we know right now with President William Ruto's privatization drive and what we've seen from the draft bill so far, is the administration headed in the right direction? There's going to be a creation of another agency that's going to have a number of government individuals involved in it in terms of being able to run the privatization agenda as well as the government would like to. So is President William Ruto in the right direction with this draft privatization bill so far?
So, we did actually have a privatization commission, which did not do a single privatization for 2 terms. So you can have all the legislation you want, but a lot will depend on how invested the president is in the process and what type of people he's got running his program. So I think for me, what has been proposed reads well and is coherent and cogent. The question will be how much of a impetus comes out of the president. I expect it to be a big impetus, and then the people who are put in charge of the whole program. I think on balance that this is going to happen. I think there is a coherent reform program being put forward by this government, and I think this is very much part of that program.
So the president has said he hopes to privatize between 5 to 10 public enterprises by the end of the year, 5 to 10 out of about 248. Who do you think could be up first on the chopping block, or who out of these enterprises do you think would make the best sort of introduction to the market, a way of putting this process on the best footing out of the gates for President Ruto's administration in terms of the enterprises that could be on the chopping block?
So I think, you could consider increasing sales of companies which are already listed at the stock exchange where the government has a stake. So, for example, Kengen, which I mentioned, Safaricom, the government could further reduce its shareholding. That would be snapped up very, very quickly, particularly if it's at a discount. Then you have some very solid companies like Kenya Pipeline, Kenya Ports Authority, where also one could foresee the government coming to the market. But definitely, you've got to come with something that has a good prospect, is already profitable, and also I think you've got to sell it at a discount to make sure buyers have a profit and want to come back for more.
All right, so I noticed you didn't mention Kenya Airlines there, KQ. We know that they've sought another bailout. Ali Khan, you're rolling your eyes, but KQ has to come up in this conversation. They're still asking for another bailout. We know government has gotten involved because of the situation that happened mid-2022 as well. Where would KQ fall in this conversation?
I don't think you can sell shares to the public in KQ. I think in KQ's case, you've got to look at a trade sale. You've got to look at selling it to a deep-pocketed Gulf carrier maybe and partnering with them, where KQ brings the Africa franchise and matches it with the Gulf carrier's international franchise. But, and this was something that was done some years ago by President Kagame, who's always very fast on the draw when he did such a deal between Rwanda Air and Qatar. We tend to be very, very slow in making our move. There is not a natural buyer for KQ from an investor point of view, simply because of the challenges that have been in running that airline profitably. I can't remember, I think it was more than a decade ago that they actually booked a profit. Therefore, I think, as I said, that story for Kenya Airways is about partnership, and it's about finding a more deep-pocketed partner who's interested in the Africa growth story.
Very interesting there. So we've talked now about also targeted companies. Let's go back to the method of asset sales and even response from potential buyers. So this is an opportunity for the Kenyan government to completely hands off many enterprises, or even partially. Depending on the company, that's what's going to be the method of the sale. But let's look at that. Give me some instances in which it should be a complete, absolute handing off of the federal government of Kenya in some enterprises, and a situation where they should look to continue to hold on to some sort of stake in a company.
So I think, the line is drawn where it's a national interest issue. So something like Kenya Ports Authority, the government surely has a role in maintaining a stake in the Mombasa port or in any other ports that the government is seeking to sell a share in. You take the sugar businesses that we have, which are multiple, there are about 10 millers that have never made a profit, and the government is keen to divest itself. There you would divest fully. There's no reason for the Kenya government to be in the sugar business. So I think you've got to look at it purely from this national interest point of view, and then things become very clear. And also, overarching it all, the government should not really be in business. So 248 is a ludicrous number of companies that the government is involved in. This should be slimmed down dramatically. And I think once you start with with that sort of philosophy, then you really can get going and make a big difference.
So I'm going to ask you to look into a crystal ball, because it will be difficult to tell what the response would be. But knowing what we know about Kenya's fiscal situation right now, what we know about some of the companies as well, what do you think the potential is for buyer interest? You've mentioned how KQ is not going to fit into this privatization bill. It's going to have a different sort of partnership. So in terms of how investors, particularly foreign companies and equity funds or whatever it may be, might be interested in Kenya's state-owned enterprises, where do we go with that? How do you think that will play off overall?
So, it's an interesting and uncertain world that we live in, and particularly in Africa, we're seeing significant pressure on our Eurobonds, on our currencies, et cetera, et cetera. So attracting investors at this point in time is something that will require intelligence, market knowledge, and so forth. But I think, Kenya is an opportunity. It's a growth market. It's an entry into East Africa and the wider region. And therefore, I think if we play our cards right, we can generate the right level of interest. But as long as we're practical on price, and as long as we're practical on the businesses that we're bringing to the market. And I think if we get all of those things right, then we could really re-engineer that sort of capital markets boom we had in 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, and really get the country on track again. If I was to pick something that would be easy, would attest to our bona fides, and would get the market excited, I would probably look at divesting some shares in something like Safaricom. That's a very profitable company. It's growing. It gets investors excited. It has tremendous name recognition. And I think you can start with that alternative, and then you can look at bringing things like Kenya Pipeline. We've got the oil and gas in Uganda. You got that excitement in that area that could also come to the market. And Kenya ports, there's a lot of excitement around infrastructure, and the Mombasa port remains the most important port between Egypt and Durban.
Mm-hmm. So earlier, when you talked about the previous privatization drive, you mentioned, of course, the positives that were gained, about over 2 million shareholders and things like that. When you look at this, again, as you've mentioned now, economic headwinds that we're seeing globally, the situation with Russia, Ukraine, which continues to really dampen growth and investor confidence overall, what do you think the stock exchange could gain if we go further down this privatization, if there is that very positive response from the market, both local, African, and international, in what Kenya is planning?
Well, the stock exchange, to be honest, has been in the doldrums. I mean, it's at sort of multi-year lows. It really needs a shot in the arm, like yesterday. And I think this is part of giving the stock exchange, the capital markets, a shot in the arm. The government has been borrowing heavily. Money has flowed into the bond market. The equity market has been left to its own devices. And it's high time it was given a big boost. And I think you get a couple of privatizations properly priced, you get some excitement domestically and internationally, and you're into a whole new ballgame. And I think it's high time, we threw the right pass and got things going.
All right, so beyond the sale of government assets and the just removed subsidy, what can Kenya's government do to reposition itself and also secure its position? We've seen where things stand with the debt as well, the deficits, and of course many other issues that Kenya currently has, which mirrors what many other African economies are going through right now. What else beyond privatization and removing subsidies and doing some of the things that the IMF and the World Bank have been recommending for a number of years now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think clearly all the signaling from the administration is that it's going to do what the IMF and the World Bank is seeking us to do. And, people you look at the IMF and the World Bank and they think of 1990s structural adjustment programs, but these two institutions have changed considerably since then. And I think essentially, for most investors, for most citizens, what they're suggesting is not way off the ball. We want to see a more liberalized economy. We want to see more capital flowing through the system, and that will create faster economic growth, which ultimately is what we all want to see in Africa, because we've got so many people we've got to give jobs to. And, the only way to do that is through growth. So on balance, I think what the government is saying is correct. I think they've got the messaging right. But the challenge for the government at this point in time is going to be finding about $4 to $4.5 billion, which is, in my estimation, the shortfall amount that's required to be covered. At the moment, the IMF and the World Bank are meeting some of that, but not all of it. And really, to get the show on the road and to get it right-sized, the government's got to dig $4 to $4.5 billion out of somewhere. And then, of course, you've got this Eurobond coming up next year, which they hope to be able to roll over. If they can roll that over, that the shortfall is less. But the challenge is a serious one, and it's a shortage of cash. In the current structure of the size of the expenditure versus the size of the taxation, the president seems to be relying on being able to increase taxes quite considerably. I'm not so sure that's going to work out, because, this is not a booming economy at the moment, and you're squeezing people more and more. Of course, he believes a lot of people are not within the tax bracket and they can be brought in. If that is true the case, that might also help in squaring the circle.
All right, Ali Khan, before I let you go, I want to expand this a bit beyond Kenya. We've seen the attempt to privatize in the 20th century, to privatize in many instances across the African continent, but it tends to have some stumbling blocks. I mentioned the labor unions earlier, but also because beyond that, there's a lack of transparency in it when it comes to privatization. But we've gone to a point where African economies simply cannot hold on to many of the state-owned enterprises that they do. Do you expect, especially with bonds coming in, with payments on debts that need to be made, we're going to start to see more of this, a more determined attempt and probably success at even another round of privatization across the continent in the coming 2-3 years, as it may be?
Absolutely. And I think, the governments have got to face a choice. Either you have a fire sale from underneath you because your numbers just don't stack up and you lose control of the process, or you get ahead of the curve and you own the process. That's the moment we're in, given the financial balance sheets that most of our governments currently have. So the choice is quite a stark one. Either you own the process and own it from now and start to deal with it like we're seeing in Kenya, or you live in fantasy economics and you hope for the best and a Hail Mary pass, and then it's going to happen without you being able to control it. So it's a stark choice. I do expect many more privatizations, and I expect many more governments to embrace this process simply because they're running out of road, running out of choices.
Running out of road, running out of choices. Ali Khan Satchu, that's where we'll end the conversation. It is a draft privatization bill. We are seeing the moves, 248 state-owned companies in Kenya. But we'll see what happens. The comments seem to have been relative, and labor unions haven't said so much as of yet. But probably when it comes down to the nail hitting or the rubber hitting the road, we might see some pushback. Thank you so much for your time.